At 0326 hours local time, a Ukrainian reconnaissance satellite passed over the western coast of Crimea and captured a thermal signature that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. Dozens of fuel storage tanks near the coastal town of Feodosia were glowing faintly on the infrared feed, freshly topped off, waiting for a resupply convoy that was scheduled to depart before dawn. What the satellite operators didn't know yet was that this depot wasn't just another logistics hub. It was the single point feeding fuel to 3 separate Russian formations across occupied Crimea, and whether Ukraine could hit it before that convoy dispersed the fuel across the peninsula would decide whether this strike mattered at all. Feodosia itself had been chosen for a reason that went beyond simple opportunity. Ukrainian intelligence had spent months tracking rail deliveries into the facility, cross-referencing tanker arrivals with satellite passes, building a picture of exactly when the depot sat at its fullest capacity. A strike on a half-empty depot barely makes the news. A strike on a depot at peak capacity, timed to catch a resupply convoy still loading, is the difference between a fire that burns itself out in an hour and one that consumes an entire logistics chain for a week. 4 hours later, a formation of Ukrainian long-range strike drones lifted off from a concealed launch site nearly 600 kilometers away. Each one carried a payload built for exactly this kind of target: incendiary warheads designed not just to punch a hole in a tank, but to ignite whatever was inside it. The flight would take most of the morning, and somewhere along that route, Russian air defense crews who had grown used to intercepting slower, more predictable drones were about to discover that this formation didn't behave the way the old ones did. By 0730, the drones had crossed into occupied territory at an altitude low enough to stay beneath most early warning radar coverage, hugging the terrain, adjusting for wind drift, correcting their courses using inertial systems that didn't depend on satellite signals Russia could jam. This was the same lesson Ukraine had learned the hard way over the previous year. Any drone that leaned too heavily on GPS was a drone that could be spoofed into flying in circles over the Black Sea until it ran out of fuel. These ones didn't have that weakness. At a radar station outside Jankoy, an operator watched his screen fill with the usual clutter: birds, wind turbines, agricultural drones from nearby farms that Russian forces had never bothered to shut down. Somewhere in that clutter, 7 signals that mattered were crawling toward the coast, and the operator had no way of separating them from the noise until it was almost too late. The formation split roughly 40 kilometers from the target, a tactic that had become standard practice for Ukrainian planners. 3 drones peeled off toward a decoy route that would draw attention toward an empty stretch of coastline. The remaining 4 held course directly for Feodosia. Russian air defense, when it finally reacted, had to choose which threat to address first, and by the time crews realized the decoy route led nowhere, the real formation had already closed half the remaining distance. A Pantsir S, 1 unit stationed roughly 8 kilometers from the depot, picked up the first genuine contact at 0812. The crew had run this drill dozens of times over the past 2 years and knew the numbers by heart. A radar-guided intercept against a slow-moving drone should be almost automatic. But this time the geometry was wrong. The depot itself, sprawling and dense with storage tanks, sat close enough to residential buildings and a rail yard that firing solutions kept getting complicated by the risk of debris falling into populated areas. The crew hesitated on 2 shots they would have taken without a second thought a year earlier. That hesitation cost them nearly 90 seconds. In that window, the lead drone crossed the perimeter fence, dropped to an altitude of barely 30 meters, and struck the first of the storage tanks directly on its northern face. The explosion wasn't instant catastrophe. It was worse than that. A slow building fire that told anyone watching that the tank had ruptured exactly where the design was weakest. Within 4 minutes, 2 more drones found their marks. One struck a secondary tank cluster near the pumping station, the connective tissue between storage and the transfer pipes that fed tanker trucks. The other clipped the edge of a berm wall meant to contain spills, doing enough damage to compromise the containment system just as fuel began pouring from the first ruptured tank. Fire crews arriving from the nearby town found themselves fighting not one fire but a spreading pool of burning fuel that the berm could no longer hold back. The 4th drone in that group missed its intended target by nearly 40 meters, clipping an access road instead of the tank it had been aimed at. On paper, that looks like a failure. In practice, It forced Russian emergency vehicles attempting to reach the site to reroute around a crater, adding critical minutes to a response that was already behind schedule. By 0824, black smoke was visible from commercial shipping routes nearly 15 kilometers offshore. Within the depot itself, the fire had jumped the containment berm entirely and was now threatening a second row of tanks that hadn't been touched by the initial strike. This is the part of a fuel depot fire that most people don't understand until they've seen it happen. It isn't really about how many tanks you hit, it's about whether the fire, once started, can spread on its own faster than anyone can contain it. Local residents in the town closest to the depot, roughly 2 kilometers from the perimeter fence, began filming the smoke column from their balconies within minutes of the first explosion, footage that would later circulate widely on Telegram channels before Russian authorities managed to restrict local internet access in an apparent attempt to control the narrative. Some of that footage showed secondary detonations occurring in a rhythm that suggested pressure building and releasing inside sealed tanks rather than a single continuous burn, a detail that told experienced observers this fire was going to get worse before it got better. Russian firefighting doctrine for this kind of facility calls for foam suppression systems built directly into the tank farm, designed to smother burning fuel before it can spread laterally. Those systems had been installed years earlier under Ukrainian ownership, back when Crimea was still administered by Kiev. Maintenance records obtained after the war began suggested that roughly a third of those systems hadn't been properly serviced since the annexation. When the crews at Feodosia tried to activate the foam suppression on the tanks nearest the original strike, only 2 of the 5 nozzle arrays responded. That failure alone turned what should have been a contained, if damaging, fire into something closer to a chain reaction. By 0840, a 5th tank, one that hadn't been struck by any drone, ignited from radiant heat alone. This is the mechanism that makes fuel depot strikes so disproportionately effective. The heat from one burning structure can be enough to bring a neighboring, undamaged tank to its flashpoint without a single additional weapon being used. Ground crews attempting to establish a fire break between the burning section and the untouched northern half of the depot found themselves working in conditions that made sustained effort almost impossible. Temperatures near the fire line were estimated well above what standard firefighting gear was rated to handle for more than a few minutes at a time. Several personnel were pulled back after showing signs of heat exhaustion within the first half hour. A regional fire chief, speaking anonymously to a journalist covering the aftermath weeks later, described the scene in terms that rarely make it into official reports. He said his crews had trained for structure fires, for vehicle fires, even for the occasional wildfire during the dry summer months. Nothing in that training had prepared them for a fuel farm where the ground itself seemed to be burning, where fuel that had leaked beneath the surface found paths through drainage channels and reappeared alight in places nobody expected. At the Regional Command Center in Simferopol, officers reviewing the incoming reports were confronting a problem that went beyond the immediate fire. Feodosia wasn't just a storage facility, it was the fuel source for coastal patrol boats operating out of 2 nearby harbors, for a mechanized brigade staging roughly 30 kilometers inland, and for resupply convoys that fed forward positions along the Perekop Isthmus. Every one of those units drew from reserves that were, as of that morning, actively burning. The convoy that had been scheduled to depart before dawn, the one Ukrainian intelligence had specifically timed the strike around, was still sitting in the depot's loading area when the first drone hit. 11 tanker trucks, fully loaded, parked in a line that put them dangerously close to the spreading fire. Drivers abandoned their vehicles and ran when the second tank ruptured, leaving fuel trucks worth easily several $1 million sitting unattended in the path of an expanding blaze. By 0855, 3 of those 11 trucks had caught fire themselves, their tanks rupturing in secondary explosions that sent burning fuel spraying across the loading area in a pattern that made it nearly impossible for remaining personnel to approach the undamaged vehicles safely. What had started as an attack on fixed storage infrastructure had, within 90 minutes, consumed a meaningful fraction of the mobile fuel reserve meant to resupply frontline units for the following week. This is where the story usually ends in most reporting on strikes like this: a burning depot, a damage assessment, a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense downplaying the scale of the loss, but the actual consequences of this strike unfolded over the following 72 hours in ways that revealed just how fragile Russia's logistics network in Crimea had become. The first sign of trouble came almost immediately. Within 6 hours of the strike, fuel prices at civilian stations in Sevastopol and Yalta jumped by nearly a third. This wasn't panic buying, it was supply reallocation. Military logistics officers, facing an immediate shortfall, began quietly diverting fuel earmarked for civilian distribution toward military use, a practice that Crimean residents had seen before during previous supply disruptions, but that nonetheless triggered long lines at the pumps within the day. Photos posted by residents outside a filling station in Simferopol showed a line of cars stretching nearly half a kilometer, drivers waiting for hours only to be told the pumps had run dry before they reached the front of the queue. Some of those same residents noted military vehicles being allowed to bypass the civilian line entirely, refueling directly from a reserved pump while ordinary drivers waited. That kind of visible favoritism tends to erode public patience faster than the shortage itself. The coastal patrol boats operating from Mizvodne and a smaller base near Chornomorsky found their operational tempo cut almost immediately. Satellite imagery from the following morning showed nearly half the patrol fleet still moored at dock, a pattern inconsistent with the near-constant coastal patrolling Russia had maintained since the war began. Ukrainian intelligence assessed this as a direct consequence of the fuel shortage. Vessels that would normally rotate through patrol routes every 8 hours were instead sitting idle, their crews presumably waiting for fuel allocations that hadn't yet arrived. This gap in coastal patrolling didn't go unnoticed by Ukrainian naval planners either. With fewer patrol boats actively covering the western approaches to Crimea, the window for further naval drone operations against targets along that stretch of coastline widened considerably, a detail that may or may not explain the timing of what happened roughly 24 hours later, but that certainly didn't hurt. Further inland, the mechanized brigade staging for what Russian state media had described as an upcoming rotation to the Zaporizhia front found its departure delayed by nearly 2 full days. Convoy movements of this kind require not just fuel for the vehicles themselves, but for the support trucks, generators, and auxiliary equipment that travel alongside them. When the primary fuel source for that rotation went up in smoke, the replacement fuel had to be trucked in from a depot near Kerch, adding almost 200 kilometers of additional transport distance and, more importantly, adding an entire day of delay that meant the brigade arrived at its new position nearly 72 hours behind schedule. 2 days of delay in a rotation schedule sounds minor when you say it out loud. It isn't. Units waiting to be relieved on the Zaporizhia front stayed in position longer than planned, exhausted troops holding ground they'd expected to hand off, while the incoming brigade arrived under strength on fuel for its own vehicles and had to spend its first day in position simply getting its logistics sorted before it could take over defensive responsibilities properly. None of this alone would have been catastrophic. Militaries deal with logistics disruptions constantly, and Russia's supply network across Crimea has weathered strikes before without collapsing entirely. What made this particular strike compound into something larger was a second event that occurred almost exactly 24 hours later, one that Ukrainian planners may or may not have anticipated when they chose their timing. At 0740 the following morning, a separate Ukrainian strike, this one involving naval drones rather than aerial ones, targeted a fuel resupply vessel attempting to make an emergency delivery run from the Russian mainland to Sevastopol. The vessel, a converted civilian tanker pressed into military logistics service, specifically because of the shortage created by the Feodosia strike, was intercepted roughly 30 nautical miles off the Crimean coast. 3 naval drones, each carrying a warhead designed to breach a hole below the waterline, struck the tanker in quick succession. The vessel didn't sink immediately, but it took on water fast enough that its crew made the decision to run it aground on a shallow section of coastline rather than risk a total loss at sea. The fuel it had been carrying, roughly 4,000 tons intended specifically to offset the losses from the previous day's strike, was salvaged only partially before the ship was declared a total loss. Crew members who survived the interception later described 3 distinct impacts within less than a minute, each one accompanied by a shudder that ran through the entire hull. By the time the captain gave the order to make for shallow water, the vessel was already listing badly enough that walking the deck required holding on to the railing. This is the moment where the story stops being about a single depot fire and starts being about a systemic failure that had been building for months. Russian logistics planners had increasingly consolidated fuel storage and distribution around a handful of major facilities in Crimea, a decision driven partly by cost efficiency and partly by the assumption that concentrated, heavily defended depots would be harder to hit than a dispersed network of smaller storage sites. That assumption had held for roughly a year. It stopped holding the moment Ukraine developed drones capable of penetrating that concentrated air defense with enough volume to overwhelm it. The emergency tanker run had been improvised specifically because Feodosia was still burning and couldn't accept the mainland fuel shipments that would normally have arrived by rail. With that improvised solution now sitting run aground on a beach, Russian command in Crimea was left with almost no immediate way to resupply the peninsula's fuel network beyond what remained in secondary, smaller depots that hadn't been designed to carry this kind of load. By the third day, reports from Crimean residents posting on regional social media channels described military checkpoints turning away civilian vehicles from certain fuel stations entirely, a sign that military reallocation had reached a point where local commanders were prioritizing operational fuel needs over maintaining even the appearance of normal civilian life. This kind of visible disruption is exactly what Ukrainian strategists have said. In public statements, they're aiming for not just military degradation, but a level of civilian friction that makes occupation itself feel increasingly unsustainable to ordinary people living under it. Bus routes connecting smaller towns to Simferopol were reportedly cut back by nearly a third during that same window, transportation officials citing fuel conservation measures without directly acknowledging the shortage's true cause. School children in at least 2 districts had their transportation suspended entirely for several days, a small but telling detail about how quickly a military logistics problem becomes a civilian one when the two systems draw from the same limited pool of fuel. Meanwhile, back at the Feodosia site itself, firefighting efforts that had begun within minutes of the initial strike were still ongoing more than 18 hours later. Thermal imagery released by open-source intelligence analysts showed hotspots persisting in at least 4 separate locations across the depot, consistent with a fire that had spread through underground fuel lines connecting individual tank clusters, a detail that suggested the damage extended well beyond what surface-level assessment could show. Analysts comparing before and after satellite imagery noted that the depot's rail spur, the single line responsible for bringing in fresh fuel deliveries from the mainland via the Kerch Bridge, ran directly alongside the tank cluster that had suffered the heaviest damage. Rail infrastructure damaged by heat and debris in that immediate area would take considerably longer to repair than the tanks themselves, meaning that even once the fire was fully extinguished, the facility's ability to receive new fuel shipments would remain compromised for weeks rather than days. Russian officials, when they finally acknowledged the strike publicly, described it in terms that minimized both the scale and the consequences, characterizing it as a minor fire at an unspecified facility that had been quickly brought under control. This pattern of understatement has become almost routine following strikes of this kind, and it serves a specific purpose beyond simple face-saving. Acknowledging the true scale of a strike like this would mean acknowledging publicly that a facility supplying fuel to multiple military formations had been effectively knocked offline by a Ukrainian drone formation launched from 600 kilometers away. That's not a message the Russian government has been eager to send, either to its own population or to the international audience watching the war's trajectory. But the numbers, once independent analysts began compiling satellite imagery, insurance filings, and shipping data, told a story that was hard to minimize. The combined losses from the depot fire and the subsequent tanker interception amounted to an estimated loss of fuel reserves sufficient to supply the affected units for close to 2 weeks under normal consumption rates. For a peninsula that depends almost entirely on fuel brought in by rail, sea, or the Kerch Bridge, a 2-week gap in reserves isn't a minor inconvenience. It's the kind of shortfall that ripples through every unit downstream of the affected depot, forcing commanders to make choices about which operations get fuel priority and which get delayed. This is ultimately what made this particular sequence of events matter more than the sum of its individual parts. A single drone strike on a fuel depot is a tactical success. A drone strike that happens to coincide with, or perhaps deliberately sets up, a follow-on naval strike against the exact resupply effort meant to compensate for it, that's something closer to a coordinated campaign, one that suggests Ukrainian planners had a fairly detailed understanding of how Russian logistics in Crimea would respond to the initial shock. Whether that coordination was the product of detailed intelligence on Russian resupply patterns, or simply the result of Ukraine running enough of these strikes that the follow-on pattern has become predictable, is something only the people planning these operations know for certain. What's observable from the outside is the pattern itself, repeated now across multiple strikes over the preceding year. Hit the storage. Wait for the improvised resupply effort that inevitably follows. Hit that too. There's a broader pattern here worth pausing on, because it says something about how this war has evolved that goes beyond any single strike. 2 years earlier, an operation like this would have required a far larger commitment of resources: manned aircraft, cruise missiles costing well over $1 million apiece, and an acceptance of far greater risk to the personnel involved. The fact that Ukraine can now achieve a comparable or even greater effect using drones that cost a fraction of that price, launched with no risk to a pilot's life, represents a genuine shift in what smaller nations facing larger adversaries can realistically accomplish. By the end of the first week following the initial strike, satellite imagery showed cleanup and reconstruction efforts underway at Feodosia, but the pace of that reconstruction told its own story. Where previous repair efforts at similar facilities had shown visible progress within days, imagery from this site showed comparatively little change over the first 7 days, a possible indicator that either specialized repair equipment was in short supply or that resources were being prioritized elsewhere, given the broader strain on the logistics network. Some analysts following the reconstruction effort noted that the specialized welding and containment repair equipment needed to rebuild tanks of this size isn't something that exists in unlimited supply anywhere, and that Russia's defense industry, already stretched thin, supplying frontline equipment, may simply not have the spare capacity to prioritize rebuilding a fuel depot in occupied Crimea over more immediate battlefield needs. If that assessment holds, Feodosia's full restoration could realistically stretch into months rather than weeks. Ukrainian officials, for their part, have been notably restrained in public statements following strikes like this one, typically limiting comment to brief acknowledgments that a strike occurred without detailing specific targets, methods, or assessed damage. This restraint serves an obvious operational purpose, denying Russian intelligence confirmation of exactly what was hit, how, and with what degree of success, information that would otherwise help Russian planners adjust their defenses for the next attempt. That next attempt, based on the pattern established over the past year, is less a question of if than when. Crimea's fuel infrastructure, concentrated as it is around a handful of major facilities, remains a target set that offers disproportionate returns relative to the resources required to strike it. A handful of drones, built for a fraction of the cost of a single cruise missile, can take a facility supplying multiple military formations offline for days or weeks at a time. That math hasn't changed, and there's little indication that Russian air defense improvements over the intervening months have meaningfully closed the gap. What has changed, gradually, is the sophistication of the strikes themselves. The Feodosia attack showed refinements in formation splitting, in payload selection specifically designed to exploit containment weaknesses, and in timing that appeared to account for how Russian forces would attempt to compensate for the initial loss. Each of these represents lessons learned from previous strikes, some successful, some not, compiled into an operational playbook that continues to evolve. For the units actually stationed in Crimea, the ones whose patrol boats sat idle at dock, whose mechanized brigade arrived 3 days late to its new position, whose fuel allocations were quietly redirected away from the civilian population they were supposed to be protecting, the strategic significance of any of this matters less than the immediate practical reality of running a military operation without reliable fuel. That reality, repeated often enough across enough facilities, is precisely the kind of slow, cumulative degradation that doesn't show up in a single dramatic headline, but that adds up, strike by strike, into something that starts to look less like resilience and more like a supply network running increasingly on borrowed time. The fire at Feodosia was, by the 12th day, officially declared extinguished. The tanks that had burned were assessed as total losses, structures that would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up rather than repaired. The 11 tanker trucks that had been caught in the loading area, the 3 that burned entirely, and the remaining 8 that suffered varying degrees of damage from heat and debris were removed from the site for either scrapping or extensive rebuild. And the improvised naval resupply effort that had been meant to bridge the gap sat for weeks afterward, visible in satellite imagery as a grounded, partially salvaged hulk on a stretch of Crimean coastline, a fairly literal monument to how quickly a logistics contingency plan can turn into another liability when the adversary is paying close enough attention to exploit it. Whether this particular strike changes anything fundamental about how Russia manages fuel logistics across occupied Crimea remains to be seen. Facilities like Feodosia can be rebuilt, resupply routes can be adjusted, and air defense postures can be reinforced in response to lessons learned from exactly this kind of attack. But every one of those adaptations costs time, money, and resources that could otherwise be directed toward the front lines further north, and every strike like this one adds another data point to a growing body of evidence suggesting that Crimea's role as a secure rear area logistics hub is becoming considerably less secure than it was when the war began. What happens next at Feodosia and at the dozen or so similar facilities scattered across the peninsula will likely follow a pattern that's become familiar over the past 2 years of this war. Repairs will proceed slowly, hampered by shortages of specialized equipment and skilled labor. Fuel will be rationed quietly, first from civilian stations, then eventually from lower priority military units, as command decides where the remaining reserves matter most. And somewhere, on a launch pad hundreds of kilometers away, the next formation of drones is likely already being prepared, its targets chosen based on exactly the kind of vulnerability this strike just confirmed still exists. The war over Crimea's fuel isn't a single battle that gets won or lost. It's a running account, tallied one depot, one tanker, one grounded ship at a time, and right now, that account keeps tilting in a direction Russian logistics planners would very much like to reverse.